He was offered as a lamb, but he awakened desires capable of setting an empire ablaze. Rome was burning, not just in flames, but in hidden fevers, in whispers that ran through the golden corridors of the palace like hungry snakes. Amidst the echoes of death and delirium, there was a young man with pale skin, sweet eyes, and a delicate voice. His name was Sporus. His existence seemed too fragile to weather the hurricane of power, and yet, through no fault of his own, he entered the darkest room in history, Nero's alcove. There, where love was confused with sadism and tenderness was an instrument of domination, Sporus was not loved, he was molded. Between crowns and invisible scars, he lived the strangest of marriages, a pact made between beauty and monstrosity. He was the female echo that Nero lost, a reflection sculpted by pain, desire, and imperial madness. But how is a lover born who never chose to love? How does one live when one's identity is erased to satisfy the emptiness of another? Esporo did not ask for the stage, but he was placed under the spotlight of a tragedy written with blood, fire, and silence. The story you are about to hear is more than an ancient scandal. It is a portrait of human fragility exposed to the insatiable gaze of absolute power. In this plot, the boundaries between victim and accomplice, between love and violence, crumble like ashes in the wind. Esporo is not just a name, it is a symbol of youth torn away, of masculinity violated, of beauty sacrificed in the name of imperial delirium. If you feel that stories like this should not be forgotten, like this video and write in the comments, "Love does not redeem." He did not choose his role. He was designated as if he were a sacred object on a profane altar where the offering was youth itself. Esporo entered the imperial halls with the fresh face of childhood, carrying a fragility that Nero's eyes mistook for divine purity. But it was not the boy he saw. It was the dead woman, the lost love, the ghost that haunted him between the satin curtains and the wine baths. Esporo became a reflection before he was a body, a reflection of a delirium, of an absence that the emperor tried to reenact, like a drunken actor who refuses to leave the stage. The mutilation came before the choice. Before his body even knew its own cycle, he was locked into an artificial time, a limbo between male and female, between the desire of others and his own silence. Castration was not just a physical act, it was a ritual rupture, a symbolic condemnation. Esporo was prevented from becoming, from growing, from asserting himself. He became a living statue, adorned and admired, but without a voice, without limits, without a future. Nero did not love him, he molded him, as if he were shaping hot clay with his hands stained with mourning. Every gesture was observed, every word measured, every sigh interpreted. Esporo quickly learned that his survival depended on gentleness, delicacy, and impeccable submission. The empire wanted him docile, and Nero wanted him perfect, but perfect according to a distorted memory, according to a woman who was already dead. Esporo did not live, he performed. And each new adornment placed on his body was also an invisible weight, a layer of imposed identity that buried his very soul under veils of silk and unspoken orders.
In Nero's bed, where power breathed heavily between purple sheets, Sporus was not a lover. He was a ritual. He was a performance. He was the altar where the emperor redeemed himself of his murderous guilt, eternally reviving the woman he crushed underfoot. And what did Esporo feel? No one asked, because in the spectacle of the empire, the scenery does not speak. It embellishes. It suffers in silence. Rome saw them together and applauded, not out of love, but out of decadence. The wedding was a public event, a divine mockery, an affront to tradition. And Esporo, dressed in white, led by guards and sordid glances, paraded among flowers and apathy like a lamb led to sacrifice. He was beautiful, he was fragile, he was convenient, and for that, he was consumed. The empire was a stage where pain was dressed up as spectacle. Esporo, who never asked for the spotlight, was exposed as a living relic of a sick love. And while Nero smiled, the young man was falling apart inside. Each round of applause was a new splinter torn from him, each banquet a ritual of erasure. Being desired by Nero was not a blessing, it was a sentence. The palace corridors knew his light footsteps. The tapestries witnessed his silent tears. The marble, cold and impassive, touched his feet as if it knew that someone who was no longer whole was walking there. Esporo slept with his face turned to the wall, as if he wanted to disappear into it.
Sometimes he dreamed of the sound of his own real name, but he woke up to Nero's voice whispering Poppaea. He breathed because his body still obeyed, but his soul had already begun to bend, like a flower in a storm, like an abandoned altar. And with each new day in the empire, Esporo ceased to be someone. He became a function, he became a memory, he became a desecrated sanctuary. With each public appearance, Esporo became more of a symbol and less of a human being. He was adorned like a bride of the gods, carried through the streets with gold-embroidered veils and eyes that could not cry. His body, sculpted by foreign hands, floated among the crowd like an omen too beautiful to exist. But it was the beauty of tragedy, the beauty that hurts, because everyone knew there walked someone who had no choice. The people laughed, the people murmured, but no one dared to call it violence. The empire called imposition love, usurpation union. Esporo smiled like a living statue, and the world was moved by his grace. But no one saw the cry behind his lowered eyelashes, the despair hidden beneath the perfume. Inside the palace, he was even less than a symbol. He was the object of imperial whims. Nero would shower him with caresses and promises, then ignore him as if he were dust on the carpets. Instability was Esporo's daily bread, never knowing whether he would be loved, humiliated, or simply forgotten.
There was no protection in luxury. Necklaces were shackles, rings were seals of submission. Baths did not wash away the pain, they only disguised it. Esporo learned to exist between veils and silences, developing the ability to disappear even in broad daylight. Being invisible was his only form of security. And when night fell and the palace walls echoed with orgies and lamentations, Esporo remained motionless, his eyes open in the darkness, fixed on an imaginary point, as if waiting for a hand to come and untie the knot that bound him to that inverted reality. But no hand came, because everyone was busy applauding the fall. Nero called him his wife. He said he loved him. He said he was just like her. But love that compares is love that erases. And in every comparison, Esporo was reduced, distorted, undone. He began to see himself through the emperor's eyes, until his image in the mirror became an unrecognizable enigma. He dreamed of his own voice. In his reveries, he spoke loudly and clearly his real name, his story, his desires. But when he awoke, everything was silent. His voice was an instrument that knew only the sound of yes, and to say no was to die. The mask had become flesh, performance was all that remained, and the more his role was praised, the more deeply he felt the irreparable loss of himself. Because no one applauds a human being, only characters.
When the empire began to crumble, Esporo's fragility became even evident, like a flower thrown into the sea at the beginning of a storm. Nero, surrounded by enemies and delusions, began to sink into paranoia, and with him he dragged those who orbited his madness. Esporo, who had been molded to satisfy, was now waste, an ornament out of place in a crumbling palace. There were no more parties, no more laughter, no more promises. All that remained were the harsh whispers of conspiracies and the smell of death haunting the golden walls. On long, humid nights, Nero touched him with trembling hands, his eyes empty of tenderness, and murmured Poppaea's name as if Esporo were just a necromancer's enchanted puppet. Confusion between reality and imagination took hold of the emperor, and each touch was both a search and a punishment. Esporo, there, felt less than a shadow. He was the space between memory and delirium, a body that carried the image of a dead woman without ever having known the taste of being whole. Isolated in the labyrinth of his own silences, Esporo no longer knew where he began or where he ended. He wondered if he had ever really existed, or if his life had been nothing more than an extension of someone else's will. No one called him by a name that was his. The name Esporo was the veil that covered what he was and what he could never be. The erasure did not happen all at once. It dripped slowly like wax from a candle that never burns out, but also never illuminates. He began to search for fragments of his own face on polished surfaces, on silver cups, on broken mirrors, in puddles of water left by the rain that came through the palace windows. But his reflection was never whole. There was always a piece missing, a cloudy eye, a blurred mouth, a neck that seemed to belong to someone else. It was as if the world refused to give him back his wholeness, as if even the glass feared to recognize the emptiness behind that enchanting image. And there was something crueler than mutilation, oblivion. Esporo understood, in silence, that the empire was losing interest in him, that the show was about to end, that the eyes that adored him were beginning to look for new tragedies. And there, in the corner of the room where he had once been caressed like an idol, he realized he was expendable. Not because he had ceased to be beautiful, but because the madness that sustained him was beginning to devour itself. He did not cry. There were no tears left. His eyes had been dry as marble for a long time, but his chest burned as if he carried a secret altar where sacrifice was never enough. Sometimes he heard the sounds of a forgotten childhood, a mother's voice calling him from afar, laughter in an open field, a soft song before bedtime, memories that slipped through his fingers like dust. Even surrounded by servants, riches, and eyes that pretended to see him, Esporo lived in exile. An exile that could not be named or represented, because it was the exile of being, of feeling, of simply existing without being deformed. A banishment that left no visible scars, but corroded what remained of his identity like rust. And so he floated through the days, as if each morning were a repetition of his own disappearance, as if each night brought not rest, but the solidification of a death that no one dared to declare.
When the gates of Rome were finally sealed against Nero,
Esporo knew, even without words, that something in him was also being shut away. The Empire had spat out the Emperor like a sick dog, and with him all those who shared in his decadence. But Esporo was not guilty. He was what remained. He was the echo left after the collapse of the temple. And even so, he was thrown into the abyss as if his mere presence were an offense to the new times. History, merciless and selective, would record Nero in dense pages of scorn. But Esporo would be a footnote, an uncomfortable reminder of how low humanity can fall when desire meets power without boundaries. Some say that Nero himself ordered his end. Others whisper that he was driven to suicide by soldiers as a purification ritual. But none of these versions matter as much as the brutal fact: he died as he lived, silenced. There was no funeral procession, no public mourning, no funeral dirge, only oblivion. The same thing that had accompanied him in life now enveloped him entirely. Spero's body, once covered in jewels and satin, may have been abandoned like an inconvenient burden. And his name, perhaps it was never spoken aloud again by those who loved him, because, perhaps, no one truly loved him.
But there are nights when Rome is restless, when the wind whispers among the ruins, among the broken arches and columns. Some swear they hear an unspoken name, a name as light as mist, but as heavy as a cross, a name that bleeds when spoken. Esporo. Not as a symbol, not as a bride, not as an illusion, but as someone who existed and was destroyed without ever having the right to be. His story is a mirror for all those who have been shaped by the hands of others, who have been desired as objects, but never seen as whole. Esporo is the portrait of a soul that was not allowed to flourish, a desecrated altar, a flower picked too soon, a light suffocated by the obsession of another. And now, by telling her name, by bringing her pain to the surface, what we do is not justice, but it is memory. And there is power in memory, because forgetting is the second death, and Esporo does not deserve to die twice. May his pain echo as a warning. May his beauty, torn away and used, serve as a mirror for the systems that still shape bodies and silences today. May his story make us ask, how many still live without being able to be who they are? How many are still adored while dying inside?
And that, in the end, before the ruins that applauded his pain so much, we may kneel in silence, not for Nero, not for Rome, but for him, for the one who was made a woman by force, loved by a monster, and forgotten by a world that applauds tragedy but never hears the cries of those consumed by it. Time passed over the ruins of Rome, and powerful names were carved in stone, but it was in the silence of a forgotten name that the most human tragedy of all rested. Esporo, molded, erased, adored, and destroyed. He did not fall as an emperor, but as a body offered to the gods of a soulless desire. While the empire fell into visible ruins, he was already dead inside, long before. His story closes like a circle of fire. It begins with beauty and ends with absence. But between these two extremes, something still breathes, something that no empire has been able to erase, the memory of the delicacy that resisted even within the golden prison. Because even cut flowers give off their scent for a while. And Sporo was a flower and was a sacrifice. If there is anything that survives everything, it is the image. And there is an image that still burns in the ancestral memory of humanity, that of a young man in a white veil walking among shadows, his eyes lost in the void, his heart silenced by the glory of others. This image does not belong only to the past,
It returns in other forms, in other bodies, whenever someone is molded by force, whenever desire becomes domination.
But not everything is erased, because even among ruins, there are seeds. Even in broken stone, there are cracks through which water springs forth. The story of Esporo is ruin, yes, but it is also a mirror. And every mirror can become a portal through which we can see our own shadows, our silent pacts with structures that still shape, silence, and sacrifice us today. Now imagine a cracked statue, not perfect, not whole, but with a crack, a single crack through which light passes. Esporo is that statue, wounded, yes, violated, yes, but through which light still insists on entering. Because even when everything is shaped for spectacle, there is still soul. And where there is soul, there is return. This is not just an old story. It is a call, a whisper from the folds of time, asking us to look more carefully at the invisible victims of our systems, that we do not confuse beauty with consent, nor silence with peace, because many still live under veils, under names they did not choose, in palaces without doors. And perhaps by remembering Esporo, we can rescue forgotten parts of ourselves, those pieces that were silenced to please, that were molded to fit, that were offered in exchange for love. May his pain be a bridge between what we were forced to be and what we can still become.
If this story touched you in any way, if Esporo echoed within you, subscribe to this channel. It helps us continue to bring to light memories that have been silenced. Comment below what you felt, what you saw reflected, what still hurts. Your voice also needs to be heard. And share this video with someone who needs to know that even the forgotten have names, that even those molded by force have souls, that even cut flowers have roots. Because there are pains that were not meant to be forgotten, but for the memory that transforms.